Hi, and welcome to You Have My Sword. This is the Fuck J.K. Rowling episode of the podcast. Let's talk about it. Before we jump in to the subject of today's episode, we're going to answer, obviously, a listener question. So, Anonymous asks, how does spellcasting differ between the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings worlds? Well, first and foremost, fuck J.K. Rowling, an absolute turf. I'd love to see a piano fall on her head, Looney Tunes style, and her shitty witch body springs back up like an accordion. With that said, okay, yeah, there are a lot of comparisons made between Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, and there is no way around that, really. To preface this, I don't know a lot about Harry Potter aside from reading the books 100 years ago, none of which I really remember. I remember maybe a lady wearing tweed outfits turning into a beetle, I think, to spy on people, which feels very British. And also the name Cho Chang, which, I'm sorry, what? Absolutely the most phoned in, probably racially insensitive name for the Asian character I've ever heard, but go off, I guess. Anyways, I've pulled a lot of Harry Potter information from Harry Potter Reddits, and while the subject isn't for me, I love to see a fandom ride so hard for what they're into. Harry Potter nerds are well and truly about that shit, and probably the only fandom to possibly rival Star Wars and Lord of the Rings for bad thematic tattoos. Anyways, let's get into it. So in both universes, magic may be word-based, right? In Lord of the Rings, whenever we see Gandalf do something magical, it does occasionally have a connection to words. He blesses Bill the Pony with words of guidance to help him get back to Rivendell. The door to Moria opens to a word. In Harry Potter, magic is, very obviously word-based, with the implication of hundreds of incantations for the various spells young witches and wizards are taught, right? However, the emphasis in Lord of the Rings is much stronger on non-verbal magic. Most of what Gandalf and the elves can do doesn't seem to rely on any kind of verbal cue. Take, for instance, the flashes of light Gandalf can produce. He wards off the Nazgul and to strike Wormtongue down, but he doesn't seem to cue it with words like an incantation in Harry Potter. He just simply does it. But the key point I want to make here is that magic in Lord of the Rings is heavily dependent on essence and is arguably not really magic at all. I would not qualify what Gandalf and the elves can do as spells. It's not like our traditional idea of a spell, so to speak, which is what we see in Harry Potter, right? Say, with Harry Potter, it's like say the magic words, put a little effort in, and you get a result. In the Lord of the Rings, this doesn't seem to be the case at all. Like in Harry Potter, if you don't get the exact word inflection right, your spell doesn't work, or you cast a different spell by accident. In Lord of the Rings, it's much gentler and less flashy, being largely dependent on the qualities of the person. I know it's confusing because we have literal named wizards in Lord of the Rings, but the magic in short is more ethereal, attached to inherent otherworldly power and divided among the beings of Middle-earth sparingly. In fact, I would go so far as to call it a property of the person and or object and not so much magic. For example, let's look at Aragorn's ability to heal. Can we really call that magic? It feels more like an inherent power. Magical in the sense that it's a transfer of energy trickled down from his lineage. Likewise, we hear that Saruman's voice is magical, but it seems to be more of an intrinsic property of his voice rather than a spell that is cast by him. And we know that the Maiar have the power of voice, often using it to guide and leverage, with the power of suggestion, so to speak. So magic not existing the way that we think magic exists is actually hinted at by Galadriel. She says, "And you," she said, turning to Sam, "for this is what you folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they seem to use the same word for the deceits of the enemy." So Galadriel is like, "I don't understand what you mean by magic," because, she grew up magical. And so the hobbits understand magic as abilities outside of, their means and their perception. They don't understand it. So it's like magical to them. But Galadriel, someone who can actually do magic, so to speak, does not view what she can do as magic. Whereas the kids in Harry Potter know that they're doing magic. They are learning magic. They are doing magic. Galadriel just feels that this is, intrinsic and personal to her, what she can do. So the magic in Lord of the Rings is not self-referential as magic. Does that make sense? It's okay if it doesn't. We're all doing our best these days. The world's on fire. Moving on. So what does this mean for spells in Lord of the Rings versus Harry Potter? If there aren't any real spells in Lord of the Rings, it's almost impossible to draw the connection between Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter in this regard. Nevertheless, I will try. As I said above, they share a word connection in some cases. I would characterize the differences in magic and spellcasting kind of as the following. And this seems to be the consensus based on Harry Potter nerds in their Reddit. So I'm taking a lot from them to make the comparisons here. So in Lord of the Rings, magic is more organic, intrinsic or internal, and subtle. First, in Harry Potter, it is more mechanical, external, flashy. To cast a spell in Harry Potter requires the waving of a wand and an incantation, even if it is silent, with power to fuel that mechanism, and results tend toward the flamboyant and showy. Spell magic in its most theatrical sense, right? Now, to cast a spell in the Lord of the Rings requires the personal skill and predisposition and force of will and or personality, with the potential aid of a staff in the cases of the Astari, but usually produces quieter effects, a more ethereal, energy-based magic that comes from Eru itself, right? Now, the closest thing in Tolkien is magical incantations that do not involve Latin. So from what I understand with Harry Potter, is most of the spell incantations are based around the Latin language, right? The War of the Ring takes place well before Rome is supposed to be founded, right? So the spells, if there is an incantation, it is based in Elvish and not in Latin, is what I was trying to say there. Okay, so in Tolkien's world, Elvish is that language that is so powerful that it can practically alter the laws of nature. It's kind of like Harry Potter's Latin. When calling on the silent aid of the good Valar, it is practically a prayer, and Frodo uses that. Elvish is to Tolkien magic as Latin is to Harry Potter incantations. Does that make sense? I'm honestly confused myself, but I'm hoping this makes sense to you guys listening. So honestly, if you've played Elden Ring, you can kind of think of Middle-earth magic as sorcery and Harry Potter magic as incantations. This makes sense, I promise. Don't think too hard about it. It makes sense. So yeah, I love how magic systems vary across fantasy, and there is no wrong way to do that. That's for sure. If you guys get rocked over magic systems like I do, I suggest reading Brandon Sanderson's books. He does magic systems like no other. They're so fresh and interesting, and you low-key kind of be like, I can see how this would work, even though every time you turn a page, you're like, wait, what? Just trust me on this. It makes sense. Brandon Sanderson's books are amazing. His magic systems are god tier. Check them out if you're looking for more fantasy to read. Okay, let's get into the episode, which is not actually about J.K. Rowling, but we're going to keep with the theme here. So, to keep with the theme so far, we are talking about Gríma Wormtongue, Saruman's little bitch assistant, who is basically just Peter Pettigrew, aka Wormtail, Voldemort's little bitch assistant. There is a wormy theme going on here, and I don't need to tell you that Tolkien did it better. So let's get into it. We're going to learn about Wormtongue. Gríma, called the Wormtongue, is obviously a fictional character in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. He appears in the second and third volumes of the work, and he is initially the chief advisor to King Theoden of Rohan and the henchman of Saruman. Now, to many psychologists, Wormtongue serves as an archetypal sycophant, flatterer, liar, and manipulator. And boy, is he. Tolkien scholars have noted that Wormtongue's interaction with Gandalf in Meduseld has an Old English counterpart in the epic poem Beowulf. The account is closely based on the hero Beowulf's dealings with Unferth and Harrowrot, where Unferth is King Hrothgar's ambiguous spokesman. Unferth is thoroughly discredited by Beowulf, as Wormtongue is by Gandalf. Now, I will say here, if you have not read Beowulf, please read it. I had to read it. It was required reading in school for me, and I'm glad I read it when I did. It was around the same time that we also had to read The Hobbit, so I think that explains a lot about my origin story here with regards to fantasy. But if you have not read Beowulf and you like Lord of the Rings, read it. It's an easy read, it's a quick read, and it is very cool. And the paragraph I just read will obviously make much more sense to you. So, okay, the critic George Clark describes Wormtongue's attitude as an example of presumption, behaving as if he were already on the throne of Rohan. Clark notes that Richard Purtill suggests that Tolkien is intentionally embodying the 7 deadly sins in his characters. He quotes from one of Tolkien's letters to this effect: "The encouragement of good morals in this real world by the ancient device of exemplifying them in unfamiliar embodiments that may tend to bring them home." Clark writes that dwarves exemplify greed, men pride, elves envy, ents sloth, hobbits gluttony, orcs anger, and Wormtongue lechery. That lechery is, Clark notes, correctly guessed by Gandalf, that he would gain a large share of Meduseld's treasure and Éowyn's hand in marriage, on whose person Gríma had long cast lecherous eyes and lascivious looks, and indeed, in Éomer's words, that Gríma had haunted her steps. "If I had a dime for every time a man haunted in my steps, I could pay Twitter to remove J.K. Rowling's account." Now, while I don't read too much into the sins representation here, it is fun to think about, right? Although I don't think this was explicitly intended by Tolkien. And while I do love to read psychologist takes on literature, I don't usually agree with them. But it's still fun, but I don't agree. For what it's worth. Okay. Gríma, son of Galmod, was at first a faithful servant, but he eventually fell in league with Saruman, and from then on worked to weaken Theoden and his kingdom through lies and persuasion in his position as chief advisor to the king. So we got some big Jafar energy here, right? Tolkien describes him as a wizened figure of a man with a pale, wise face and heavy-lidded eyes, and a long, pale tongue. Gríma was widely disliked in Edoras. Everyone except Theoden called him Wormtongue. In Old English, worm means serpent, snake, or dragon, and Gandalf repeatedly compares him to a snake. Now, Gríma Wormtongue was a man of Rohan, allied with the wizard Saruman during the War of the Ring, as we know. He was appointed as counselor of King Theoden of Rohan, but betrayed the king by weakening his mind to prepare for Saruman's invasion of Rohan. Gríma followed Saruman until he turned against him at the end of the war, and Gríma and his master's deaths were the last deaths during the war, which we will talk more about. It is possible that Saruman promised Gríma power as well as the marriage of Éowyn, King Theoden's niece, whom Gríma greatly desired. Gríma, Wormtongue, was told by Saruman to take hold over King Theoden, right? So essentially, Saruman is promising Wormtongue pussy, and he is putting that pussy on a pedestal and is doing the most for it. That is kind of the stage that has been set here. He's a simple man. Okay, so Saruman told Gríma to weaken the king so that Saruman and Wormtongue could take over Rohan. The combined powers of Gríma and Saruman nearly drove Theoden mad and led the kingdom into decay. Gríma began taking over Theoden's mind in year 3014 of the Third Age. He poisoned the king, which made him seem to be withering away prematurely. Gríma also stole valuable items from both the king and the house of Eol, including the king's sword Herugrim, which he locked in a chest. He sent other items of value to Saruman. Gríma spent much of his time tormenting the king by convincing him that he was too old for warfare. Theoden had once been a strong warrior, but now he never left Meduseld. So Gríma is smart. He's like hitting Theoden where it hurts. He knows that Theoden's pride comes from having been a strong warrior, and probably still at that point a strong warrior, but is kind of inflicting psychological warfare here, knowing that this would kind of hurt Theoden the most. Gríma slowly but surely began to influence Theoden's decisions. He advised King Theoden on every matter that came to his court. This meant that every decision made in the kingdom of Rohan was indeed influenced by Gríma. The people of Rohan strongly disliked Gríma and his policies, and he was clouding the king's vision. And this was clear to pretty much everybody, right? But they did not know that he was a traitor. They did not fuck with him, but they did not know to the degree in which Gríma was fucking with shit. In addition to weakening Rohan's government, Gríma attempted to weaken Rohan's military. The king's commanders were the second marshal of the Mark, the king's son Theodred, and the third marshal of the Mark, the king's nephew Éomer. We know these guys, right? So he could not get either of them to turn against the king or against each other. He managed to talk Theoden into resenting his own son and nephew. He told Theoden that Éomer was power-hungry and disobedient, even though both Theodred and Éomer refused to disobey the king even when his orders came from Gríma. Gríma followed Éowyn much of the time. He loved her, desired her, and he looked forward to the day that they were to be married, as Saruman had promised this. Yeah, Gríma really thought that he had Éowyn in the bag. On September 19th, 3018, Gandalf the Grey Wizard arrived at Edoras. He demanded to speak with Theoden, but Gríma refused the wizard admittance. The next day, Theoden allowed Gandalf in, and he warned the king of Saruman's plan to invade Rohan. After hearing this, Theoden and Gríma banished Gandalf. So Theoden was totally buying into what Gríma was saying, did not believe Gandalf, and essentially exiled him. Gríma then rode to Isengard with great speed to tell Saruman of Gandalf's visit. On the return journey, he was confronted by the Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul, and told him all that he knew, including the fact that Saruman had hidden his knowledge of the Shire and the Ring Bearer from the Dark Lord Sauron. So Saruman soon came to realize that Theodred posed a threat to his own plans. He sent out a force to kill him and succeeded in the first battle of the Fords of Isen on February 25th, 3019. Erkenbrand sent a request to Theoden for his armies to return to the Westfold at once, but Gríma denied the army's permission. Fucked up. This way, Edoras was left defenseless. So, Éomer soon learned of orcs and Uruk-hai traveling through Rohan to Isengard. Éomer wanted to intercept the orcs and slay them, but Gríma did not grant permission. Fucking big surprise here, huh? Éomer did so anyways, knowing that Theoden would have granted permission on his own free will. So Éomer's kind of like, fuck Gríma, we're not listening to you. They're no longer buying his bullshit, and kind of just doing what they want based on what they know Theoden would say before he had like his brain corrupted by Gríma, right? Éomer then encounters Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli on the way back to Edoras and let them roam freely, for he knew them to be good-willed, obviously. Éomer was therefore imprisoned for disobeying the king and for allowing travelers to roam freely. Now, on March 2nd, Gandalf arrived again at Edoras, this time with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Gríma distrusted Gandalf, so he gave orders for his staff to be removed before he could enter Meduseld. However, the Dorward Hama saw Gandalf as a friend and allowed the wizard entrance with his staff. Gríma called Gandalf Lathspell, meaning ill news, which is what I am to assume a hardcore wizard street diss of some kind. He then accused Gandalf of bringing bad tidings. Gandalf then revealed himself to be Gandalf the White and raised his staff high. Oh, in what is one of the sickest reveals simply ever. So, with a rumble of thunder and a bolt of lightning, Gríma fell to the ground powerless. Gandalf then released Theoden from Saruman and Gríma's influence. Theoden wanted to ride to war against Saruman. Gríma began to fear, and he was forced to give up the chest with Herogrim and other stolen Rohirrim heirlooms. A conscious now King Theoden offered Gríma two options: fighting with Rohan against Saruman, or getting the fuck out. Gríma chose to get the fuck out, and when Theoden reached out to Gríma, he spat on his hand and ran. Okay, dude. Okay, yeah, Theoden said, kiss the rings. Gríma said, I'm good. Okay, so now Gríma has fled to Isengard to report his defeat to Saruman. On the way, he may have been joined by Saruman's orcs. He arrived at Isengard alone on March 5th. He was astonished to find that the entirety of Isengard had been flooded and the walls had been knocked down and everything but the Tower of Orthanc had been destroyed. Shit was fucked up. The Ents had taken management of Isengard. Treebeard found Gríma and lifted him off of his horse and threatened him. Gríma, terrified, obviously, claimed to be running an errand on behalf of Theoden. He also claimed himself to be the only Rohirrim brave enough to enter Isengard. However, Treebeard had been told about Gríma beforehand by Gandalf. So Gandalf was like, Treebeard, heads up, if you catch this little fucker, don't believe a word he says. So Treebeard gives Gríma a choice. He could wait for Theoden or go inside Orthanc with Saruman. So what do we think happened? Gríma obviously headed into the tower and Saruman yanked his ass inside. Gandalf, Theoden, Éomer, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arrived later that day to confront Saruman at Orthanc. Gandalf punished Saruman for his evil by removing the wizard's staff, which, you know, is pretty much a huge blow to Saruman, who is an Istari, which means he's essentially a wizard, right? Taking his staff. So, Gríma threw down the Palantir of Orthanc in an attempt to hit Gandalf, but Aragorn pointed out that Gríma hesitated before throwing. He was not sure if he wanted to hit Gandalf or Saruman. So, Aragorn kind of was like, oh wait, I noticed a slight hesitation, and kind of could read Gríma right then and there, sort of showing that he didn't love his allegiance with Saruman. And it looks like Saruman read into this a bit as well, because Saruman noticed this hesitation. It angered him greatly, and he beat the bricks off Gríma. Now, on August 15th, after the War of the Ring was won by the Free People, this is after the events of the War of the Ring, Saruman convinced Treebeard to release him from Orthanc. Gríma obviously followed him, and the Ents noticed that he had clearly been beaten by his master. So the Ents were kind of like, yo, this dude is getting the shit beat out of him, but he is like fully Stockholmed at this point by Saruman. Okay, so Saruman and Gríma traveled northward. They encountered Gandalf, Frodo, and the hobbits Galadriel, Celeborn, and Elrond on the road. Now, they offered help and advice, but Saruman bitterly refused and ordered Gríma, telling him to kind of move along, don't humor them. But Gríma kind of saw all of these guys on the road and was like, is this my way out? Should I make a run for it, essentially? But Saruman, being prideful, did not accept their help. And he and Gríma just moved along. So Gríma then revealed to Gandalf that he hated Saruman because he was cruel to him, and Gandalf only suggested that he leave his master. At this, Gríma shuddered and followed his master closely. Gandalf was like, okay, bitch, and leave then. What the fuck? So Gríma, in so many words, was like, I hate it here. This sucks. Gandalf was like, my guy, just leave then. But Gríma was like terrified to leave, like I said, fully Stockholmed, and continued up the road with Saruman. So this next part we did an entire episode about. Last episode, episode 12, Panic at the Shire. So if you listened, you'll know all about this. But if this next part is interesting to you and you'd like to know more, we'll go on and listen to the episode before this one, which is a wild ride. Okay, so anyways, Saruman decided to invade the Shire. So as he and Gríma were walking north and ignored the help from everybody that they encountered walking northward, they were on their way to invade the Shire. So he named himself chief and moved to Bag End, which was the home of Saruman's supposed ally, a hobbit called Lotho Sackville Baggins. This is the guy with the most fucked up haircut in the Shire, hands down. However, Saruman ordered Gríma to stab Lotho in his sleep, and the wizard spread a rumor that Gríma ate Loth's head and dead body. Like, what a gossipy bitch. Absolutely petty. So the accuracy of this rumor is unknown, right? I love that that even has to be said. Now, on November 3rd, Saruman's ruffian men engaged in the Battle of Bywater against uprising hobbits. The hobbits were victorious, and Frodo Baggins ordered Saruman to leave Bag End. The wizard did so, and Gríma crawled in an attempt to follow him. Frodo, being a sweet baby angel, offered Gríma food and shelter, and the man very much wanted to accept. So Gríma, more than anything, wanted to stay in the Shire, wanted to accept Frodo's help. But Saruman told Frodo that Gríma had killed Lotho in order to hopefully disgust and dissuade Frodo from letting Gríma stay. However, Frodo forgave Gríma when Gríma said that Saruman had put him up to it. So Gríma was like, yes, this happened, but Saruman made me do it. Frodo was like, I totally get it. No problem. All is forgiven. But this was when Saruman laughed at Gríma and then kicked him in the face. Gríma had now finally endured enough torture. He became very angry, so he turned against his master. Gríma jumped on Saruman and slit his throat with his knife. Gríma was finally free. But as he crawled away, 3 hobbit archers pierced the man, killing him. This was the final act during the War of the Ring. A hell of a fucking way to end the books, right? Also, sorry, spoiler alert, I guess. But yeah, that is literally how the books end. It is the final death in Lord of the Rings, was Gríma getting taken out by 3 hobbit archers. Anyways, that pretty much sums up Gríma and his adventures. He is sort of a pitiful character, right? Just like Peter Pettigrew in Harry Potter. I feel like there is a huge comparison to be made between those 2 characters. And I think if I had to stomach any of the comparisons made from Harry Potter to Lord of the Rings, or vice versa, this one is my favorite comparison. This one I can see clear as day. But yeah, so I hope you learned something, and if you didn't, that's fine too. Anyways, you know where to find us. YouHaveMySwordPodcast.com has all links to socials and where you can support. And honestly, I want to end this podcast to remind y'all that trans rights are human rights, and if you're a J.K. Rowling yourself, this is not the podcast for you. But for those of you that believe in human rights, you have my sword.
Edgeworks Nebula.